Welcome to the debate. Imagine a tiger jumps out of the brush at you.
Always a terrifying thought.
Right. But in a fraction of a second, before you even consciously register fear, your heart rate spikes, your airways open up, and your blood just floods with sugar. So the question is, who gave that order?
Exactly.
Did your brain's central command send out an urgent directive? Or did a rogue cluster of cells just, take over your biology to save your life?
It really is the ultimate question of biological governance. I mean, when we look at how a resilient, dynamic system actually functions on the ground, we often find that the most critical decisions aren't made by a master planner.
Hmm.
They happen instantly, they're based on local conditions, without waiting for permission from the top.
And that structural tension perfectly captures the physiological landscape we are exploring today. We are looking deeply into the endocrine system.
A fascinating topic.
It really is. For those of us fascinated by how the human machine regulates itself, the endocrine system is the body's second great control network. It works alongside the fast-acting nervous system, but instead of electrical sparks, it uses chemical messengers, hormones, to maintain homeostasis.
And the specific question we are wrestling with today, drawn from foundational analyses of chemical homeostasis, is this. Is the endocrine system best understood as a strict, top-down command hierarchy governed by the brain?
Or conversely, is its true genius found in a decentralized, autonomous network of self-regulating feedback loops?
Right.
So I will be arguing that the system is fundamentally centralized. It relies on the hypothalamic-pituitary axis as the master controller of our physiological state. It is basically an executive branch that coordinates all vital functions from the top down.
And I'll be arguing that the system is inherently decentralized. The idea of top-down control is, well, it's largely an illusion. The endocrine system is actually driven by independent peripheral sensors and receptor-level specificity that dictate the body's reality from the bottom up.
Let me lay out why the command hierarchy model is the most accurate way to understand this system. When you look at the architecture of the endocrine system in detail, you realize that all systemic chemical reality ultimately answers to the brain.
I think answers to is a strong phrase there.
But it does. The core of this system is the integration of the nervous and endocrine systems at the hypothalamus, sitting right there in the center of the brain. The hypothalamus is the ultimate translator.
Sure, a translator.
It takes rapid electrical neural signals, stress, temperature, light, and converts them into slower, more profound chemical waves.
But simply being a translator doesn't make it the absolute commander of the body?
It does when you look at what it translates those signals into. The hypothalamus directs the pituitary gland, which sits just below it, and functions as the body's master gland. I mean, the anatomy alone dictates a top-down flow.
How so?
Well, the hypothalamus communicates with the anterior pituitary via a dedicated, private vascular highway called the hypophyseal portal system. It drops specific releasing and inhibiting hormones into this private bloodstream. From there, the anterior pituitary deploys massive system-wide regulators.
Okay. Yes, the big ones.
Right, we're talking about growth hormone, thyroid-stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, and the reproductive regulators. Even the posterior pituitary acts as a direct physical extension of the brain's neural tissue to manage crucial fluid balance and reproductive functions. Everything cascades downward from this central neuroendocrine nexus.
I come at it from a completely different way. Because when you look beyond the cranial vault, that top-down narrative really starts to fall apart.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the decentralized autonomous network model is far more accurate because many of our most vital, life-sustaining organs simply do not wait for brain orders. They don't care what the hypothalamus is doing.
I think they care a little bit.
Oh, let's look at the pancreas in detail. Within it, you have these clusters of cells called the islets of Langerhans. They contain dual-action cell populations. You have beta cells that secrete insulin and alpha cells that secrete glucagon.
But they are still reacting to a systemic state.
Yes, but they do it blindly and locally. The pancreas isn't thinking about glucose, and it certainly isn't waiting for a signal from the pituitary gland. The beta cells literally use the glucose entering them to produce ATP. Cellular energy.
Right, the energy currency.
Exactly. And when that energy hits a critical tipping point inside the cell, it triggers a physical potassium gate to close. That shifts the electrical charge, which physically pops insulin out into the blood to lower blood sugar.
A mechanical reaction.
It is pure blind mechanics. The pancreas directly senses the local chemical environment and immediately acts. And it's not just the pancreas. The parathyroid glands monitor blood calcium levels and release hormones to elevate calcium without any hypothalamic input whatsoever.
So you are arguing that because local sensors exist, the central hierarchy just doesn't matter?
I am arguing the central hierarchy isn't the primary driver of the system. Think about the hormone receptor paradigm. A central gland can secrete all the hormones at once into the bloodstream, washing over the entire body.
True.
But that hormone is completely useless unless it encounters a target cell that possesses a specific matching protein receptor. The secreting gland in the brain is essentially just shouting into the void.
That's a bit dramatic.
It's true, though. It is the local cellular receptor that decides if, when, and how to listen. The true site of control, the actual arbitration of biological reality, happens at the local cellular level, not the central gland.
I see the appeal of that perspective, I do, but we need to look at the micromechanisms of how these commands are actually executed. When we transition from the macroanatomy down to the cellular mechanisms, we see a profound difference in power dynamics.
Okay, let's go down to the cell.
Consider steroid hormones. These are hormones derived from cholesterol, like cortisol, testosterone, and estrogen. Because they are lipid-soluble, they do not need a surface receptor's permission to enter a cell.
Right. They slip right through.
Exactly. They easily bypass the fatty phospholipid bilayer of the cell membrane, diffuse directly into the inner cytoplasm or nucleus, and bind to intracellular receptors.
They still require a receptor, though.
True, but look at what they do once they bind. The hormone receptor complex acts directly as a transcription factor. It binds directly to the cell's DNA and physically alters gene expression to synthesize entirely new proteins.
Which takes a while.
Yes, but if I can use an analogy, steroid hormones act like constitutional amendments. They may be slower to implement, taking hours or even days to ramp up, but they structurally alter the long-term genetic expression and infrastructure of the biological system.
A constitutional amendment. That's a strong analogy.
It represents deep, systemic, top-down command. When the central axis releases a signal that results in a steroid hormone, it isn't just asking cells to change their behavior. It is rewriting their operational code.
The constitutional amendment analogy is vivid, I'll give you that. But the fact that the body occasionally drafts an amendment does not prove that a centralized hierarchy is the system's true genius.
Why not?
Because survival rarely allows us the luxury of waiting for an amendment to be drafted, debated, and ratified in the nucleus. Survival requires rapid, dynamic adaptation, and that is a domain of peptide and protein hormones, which make up the vast majority of hormones in the body.
Which, as you'll admit, are mostly deployed by the central pituitary gland.
Deployed, yes, but let's look at how they function at the cellular level. Peptides, which are chains of amino acids like insulin or growth hormone, are water-soluble. They physically cannot penetrate the lipid boundary of a cell membrane.
So they stay outside.
Right. They are restricted to knocking on the door, binding to surface receptors. But you frame this as a weakness compared to steroids. It is actually their greatest strength, because by binding to the surface, they trigger a signal transduction cascade inside the cell.
You mean the second messengers?
Single interaction changes the shape of a protein inside the cell, which activates an enzyme.
Okay.
Now here is a mechanism that proves the power of the local cell over the central gland. Amplification. One single hormone molecule binds to the outside. That activates maybe 10 relay runners inside. Those 10 activate 100 enzymes.
And it cascades from there.
Those 100 enzymes alter millions of molecules in seconds. It amplifies a single peripheral signal into a massive intracellular response instantly. The cell already has the enzymes built and waiting. It just needs the spark.
I mean, yes, it's efficient.
If an endocrine command system is truly effective, why would it rely on the slow transcription of steroids for survival? The sheer prevalence of these rapid local cascades triggered by peptides proves that the biological system prioritizes immediate localized reaction over ponderous central command.
Well, if peptides are so fast and effective, why do we even have a top-down hierarchy?
That's a fair question.
You see the answer clearly when the body faces a systemic crisis that local sensors simply cannot handle alone. This brings us to how the body manages stress. Let's look at the adrenal glands, which sit right on top of the kidneys. If we want to test whether hierarchy or autonomy is more critical, look at the adrenal cortex.
You're talking about long-term stress here.
I am talking about severe, prolonged threats, say starvation or severe trauma. In those scenarios, a rapid local peptide response is entirely insufficient. The hypothalamus must initiate a complex cascade,
The bureaucratic chain.
the necessary chain. It sends a releasing hormone to the anterior pituitary, which then drops ACTH into the blood. That ACTH travels all the way down to stimulate the adrenal cortex to produce those slow, powerful corticosteroids we talked about earlier.
Right.
This centralized chain of command deliberately deploys hormones like cortisol. And what does cortisol do? It stimulates gluconeogenesis to systematically increase blood sugar. But at the same time, it deliberately dampens the immune response.
Right. It acts as an anti-inflammatory.
But think about why it does that. It is highly coordinated rationing. Fighting an infection takes massive amounts of cellular energy. If you are starving, your brain calculates that surviving the famine is more critical in that moment than fighting off a potential cold.
It's triage.
Yes. So it suppresses the immune system to allocate that saved glucose exclusively to the brain and vital organs. A local sensor in your pancreas or your gut cannot perform that kind of macroeconomic triage. Only a central command could weigh those systemic priorities and decide what to sacrifice.
That makes perfect sense for a famine. But what happens when the threat isn't a long-term famine, but that tiger leaping out of the brush we talked about at the beginning?
The acute threat.
Exactly. In a true, immediate emergency, your complex bureaucratic chain of ACTH and cortisol is going to get you killed. It is way too slow. And the body knows this. That is why the inner core of that same gland, the adrenal medulla, operates completely differently.
Which relies on neural input.
Exactly. It proves my point. The adrenal medulla is basically a bundle of nerve endings that skipped the middleman. When survival is on the line, the brain doesn't send a chemical letter through the blood via the pituitary hierarchy. It picks up a direct red phone.
Well,
The sympathetic nervous system fires directly into the adrenal medulla, completely bypassing the hormonal chain of command. The medulla then dumps epinephrine and norepinephrine directly into the bloodstream for an instant fight or flight response.
a huge adrenaline dump.
The heart rate elevates, airways dilate, energy is mobilized in seconds. The fact that the adrenal gland itself is split physically between the slow cortical hierarchy and the fast medullary bypass proves that when things truly matter, the body abandons the endocrine hierarchy in favor of direct, immediate intervention.
Wait, I don't see that as an abandonment of the hierarchy at all. You are blurring the lines between the nervous system and the endocrine system.
How so?
The fact that the central brain uses a faster direct neural wire to trigger the adrenal medulla in an emergency actually reinforces my position. The brain is still the one making the call. It just uses a faster phone line. It is still centralized command.
That's a convenient reframing.
It's the anatomical truth. But if we want to talk strictly about endocrine control without the neural shortcuts, we have to examine homeostatic calibration. Let's talk about negative feedback loops.
Ah, the bread and butter of the endocrine system.
Exactly. Almost the entire endocrine system is governed by negative feedback, and this mechanism proves the central brain's ultimate oversight. Let's take the thyroid gland.
Sure.
The thyroid sits in the neck and produces thyroxine, or T4 and T3. These hormones regulate the body's basal metabolic rate, oxygen consumption, and heat production. When the thyroid produces elevated levels of these hormones, the central brain, specifically the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary, detects this rising chemical reality in the blood.
And it reacts to it.
It actively suppresses the initial stimulus. It cuts off the secretion of thyroid-stimulating hormone. The central command manages its own brakes. It constantly monitors the systemic output from the periphery and adjusts the dials downward to prevent metabolic overshoot.
Okay.
The true intelligence of the system resides right there, in the center's ability to read the peripheral data, calculate the threshold, and actively calibrate its downward directives.
I look at that exact same biological loop and I see the absolute opposite conclusion.
Of course you do.
Doesn't a negative feedback loop actually prove that the system is fundamentally bottom up? Let's dissect your thyroid example carefully. If the peripheral change, the rising thyroxine in the bloodstream, is what physically dictates the brain's behavior, causing it to shut down TSH production, then who is actually in charge?
The brain is, because it issues the stop order.
But the so-called central master is only acting based on the chemical signals forced upon it by the peripheral servant. The hypothalamus is completely tethered to the chemical reality dictated by the thyroid gland. It has no independent agenda.
It has a set point.
It is a reactionary node. If my local metabolic rate dictates what the hypothalamus is allowed to secrete, then the hypothalamus isn't a commander making independent executive decisions. It is merely a sensor and a relay switch in a decentralized loop. The intelligence and the power reside in the self-regulating nature of the loop itself, not in the anatomical location of the pituitary gland.
Wait, you are giving the peripheral glands entirely too much credit here. If the system is entirely bottom-up and just a collection of independent reactionary loops, how does the body coordinate opposing functions simultaneously without tearing itself apart?
What do you mean by tearing itself apart?
Look at calcium regulation. Calcium is desperately needed for muscle contraction and neural firing. If your blood calcium drops too low, your respiratory muscles can spasm and you die.
Very bad news.
The stakes are incredibly high. The thyroid gland doesn't just regulate metabolism, it also secretes a hormone called calcitonin. Calcitonin actively lowers blood calcium levels by inhibiting osteoclasts. Now, osteoclasts are specialized cells that act like microscopic bulldozers. They break down bone matrix to release stored calcium into the blood.
Right.
Calcitonin stops the bulldozers, but simultaneously, resting right on the back of the thyroid, the parathyroid glands secrete parathyroid hormone, or PTH, which elevates blood calcium by actively stimulating those exact same osteoclasts to dissolve bone.
Right. They are antagonistic hormones.
Exactly. You have one gland trying to build bone and lower blood calcium, and another gland right next to it trying to strip bone and raise blood calcium. Doesn't the very existence of these competing, finely tuned metabolic levers require an overarching systemic design?
I don't think it does.
If it were just blind, localized cellular reactions, you would have chaos, a biological tug-of-war wasting massive amounts of energy. The fact that they operate in a delicate, balanced seesaw implies a systemic architecture that transcends local autonomy.
That is a beautiful way to visualize it. But that balance you were describing does not require a conscious architect. It emerges entirely naturally from the competing mathematical limits of the receptors themselves.
Mathematical limits?
Yeah. The parathyroid doesn't need to consult the brain, nor does it need to consult the thyroid's calcitonin output. It simply reads the blood calcium concentration. If the calcium drops below a precise genetically determined molarity, the parathyroid cells depolarize and release PTH.
And when it rises?
When the calcium rises back above that threshold, the physical binding of calcium to the parathyroid receptors shuts off the release.
So it's just a mechanical thermostat to you.
Exactly. And the thyroid C cells do the exact inverse with calcitonin. It is entirely blind and yet entirely perfect. It's the same way the islets of Langerhans manage glucose. The alpha cells and beta cells sitting right next to each other in the pancreas push and pull against each other.
Glucagon and insulin?
Right, glucagon raising sugar, insulin lowering it. They create perfect chemical homeostasis without a single neural input or strategy memo from the hypothalamus. The elegance of the endocrine system and why I insist on the decentralized model is that you don't need a CEO to manage the competing levers. The levers manage themselves through the sheer chemical physics of their localized receptors.
But those independent levers operate within a broader physiological context that only the central axis can provide. The thermostat in a room might operate blindly, but someone had to set the temperature of the house based on the season.
Fair analogy.
As we pull these threads together, I maintain that the hypothalamic pituitary axis is the definitive command center. Yes, local glands like the pancreas or parathyroid have their autonomous, localized reflexes, but the overarching integration of the human organism, navigating complex stress, dictating growth spurts, managing reproductive cycles, and setting the baseline for basal metabolism, that requires a central translation of neural states into chemical realities.
Hmm.
The anterior pituitary's portal system and its deployment of master regulators represent a necessary top-down integration. Without that centralized hierarchy, the body would be a collection of isolated reflexes, completely incapable of long-term strategy.
And I remain steadfast that the system's true brilliance lies precisely in those decentralized, autonomous feedback loops. A centralized command hierarchy is inherently fragile. If the center fails, the whole organism dies.
Well, yes.
By distributing vital controls, handing glucose management to the pancreas, calcium management to the parathyroid, and emergency survival to the adrenal medulla, the body ensures that localized crises are handled instantly and efficiently. They don't have to wait for the slow transcription of centralized directives. Ultimately, a hormone is only as powerful as the receptor that receives it. The ultimate arbitration of your biological reality happens at the microscopic peripheral level, not in the brain.
Yet, despite our substantive disagreement on the structural nature of its leadership, I think we arrive at a profound convergence regarding what this system is actually trying to achieve. Regardless of whether the endocrine system operates primarily from the top down or the bottom up, its ultimate triumph is chemical homeostasis.
Oh, absolutely. The intricate dance we've discussed today, the slow structural rewriting by steroid hormones, the massive instantaneous amplification cascades of peptide second messengers, the push and pull of opposing hormones like insulin and glucagon.
It's incredible.
It is. They all exist for one purpose. They maintain our internal physiological parameters within an incredibly narrow functional range, constantly preventing metabolic overshoot and collapse.
Understanding the endocrine system in detail really requires us to hold both of these perspectives at once. We have to appreciate the vast, slow-moving, centralized directives that govern our long-term development, while simultaneously marveling at the rapid, independent peripheral sensors that keep our blood chemistry stable minute by minute.
And there is so much more to explore in this material. The true test of these models often reveals itself when the system breaks down.
Like in disease states.
Exactly. Examining how these specific, highly tuned hormone cascades interact and sometimes fail, like the receptor failures in type 2 diabetes or the feedback loop breakdowns in hyperthyroidism. It offers entirely new layers of complexity.
So the next time you feel your heart race in a moment of panic, or you feel your energy crash after a meal, or you slowly adapt to a long, stressful month, ask yourself, are you experiencing the highly coordinated directives of a centralized biological command? Or are you witnessing the decentralized democracy of your own autonomous cells?